Hello, I'm Matt Reardon, and thanks for watching this Wednesday evening West Weather Update on April 5th, brought to you by Nutrien Ag Solutions. To start here, we are looking at water vapor satellite imagery from the Northeast Pacific, just off the northwest coast of the United States. If you look closely here, you see these clouds moving quite quickly as they kind of come on shore here over the Pacific Northwest. That is the jet stream. I think you can kind of tell just how quickly some of these clouds are moving here, kind of opening up a trough here, again, off the northwest coast of the U.S. This is really our next weather maker. Over the next 24 to 48 hours, that jet stream will come on shore over the Pacific Northwest. The effects from this really could be felt as early as this evening in some of these coastal areas where light rain showers are expected tonight here on Wednesday night. And I think that continues through the day, Thursday and Friday. We'll talk about that in the forecast, but it's just kind of neat to see the system evident already here on satellite imagery coming closer and closer to the Pacific Northwest coastline here. If we take a look at this website, if you've not seen this before, it's pretty neat. It's earth.nullschool.net and just gives you this very neat picture or imagery of those jet stream level winds. And you can kind of come over here and pick exactly what level you want to look at. This one is at that jet stream height. It's hard to see the North American coastline here. Here's Alaska coming down through the Pacific Northwest, and there's those fast jet stream level winds we talked about kind of opening up into a trough here as this entire trough makes its way over to the Pacific Northwest, where it's going to affect the area at least for the next 48 hours, depending on where exactly we are, and then kind of moving in on shore into the northern Rockies over the next 72 hours in this weekend. Now, talking about the northern Rockies, something we have discussed this year was the abundance of snow that we had through the kind of the central western U.S., California, Nevada, Utah, just recently joining the states breaking their record snowpack. Arizona, the upper Colorado River Valley, snow building up there, which will then flow into Lake Powell, Lake Mead. We'll talk about those levels here in just a bit. But the northern Rockies, Idaho, Washington, parts of Oregon, not receiving quite the same level of focus from those jet stream and atmospheric river events earlier this year, could still stand to gain a bit more in terms of their snowpack this year. We are still seeing kind of some lingering drought issues up there. I will say, as a result of some of the recent activity, this is looking at soil moisture as estimated by NASA. We have had improvements in the soil moisture, I think improvements in the drought situation here in 2023, based on where we started earlier in the year. And if you see here, we have some saturated soils, or at least wetter soils, in the Snake River Valley, I think through the Middle Snake, at the parts of the Lower Snake River Valley. Over in the Willamette Valley, improved some soil moisture situations over there as a result of the recent rainfall and showers in eastern Washington. Some pockets in there still a bit dry, but some areas doing a little bit better than they were earlier this year. Jumping over, looking at the drought monitor, you still see that lingering dryness across the Northwest. Certainly parts of highlands and central Oregon, some of the mountains in Idaho. That yellow color you see there isn't technically classified as drought, but that moniker there, abnormally dry. So we have been dry in some of these areas where we could use some more water. So he's seeing an active kind of storm incoming, I think is good news for some of these areas, as long as they don't need some more inclement weather or effects from this. An area that stands out, just looking at this map, we've certainly talked about it in just about every video we've made here in 2023, is California, the Central Valley. Now, entirely drought-free, just some abnormally dry, lingering classification in the North Valley there. Another way of visualizing this is looking at the 8-week drought change map. So it's that drought monitor map you were just looking at, but how have we improved or degraded in that drought situation over the last 8 weeks since January 31st? And you'll notice California, drastic improvement in terms of their drought situation, the green color table showing up there. Nevada, Utah, talked about their record snowpack that they recently cleared. The upper Colorado River Valley, northern Arizona, northwest New Mexico, even far southwest Colorado. But the areas on this map that are maybe missing out a little bit on the summer of water and out west are parts of northern Oregon. We talked about central Oregon, parts of Washington, but we have had improvements there in the Snake River Valley and the Treasure Valley in eastern Oregon as well, where we saw those soil moistures doing a bit better in terms of saturation. Taking a closer look at reservoirs in Idaho, drought improvement seen there. As we've kind of gone through the year here in 2023, I think that's reflected in some reservoirs closer to those fill lines. You can see these teacup diagrams here. Reservoirs around 63, anywhere from like 63 to 75% here So doing better in eastern, kind of the eastern Snake River Valley side of things. If we jump over and look at the Treasure Valley, kind of the eastern Oregon area, teacup's a bit more empty, not even quite at 50% yet. So room to improve here in some of these areas where we have lingering dryness in the northern Rockies. That snowpack higher up in the mountains for some of these reservoirs won't be accounted for yet, right? We're going to have to warm up eventually. Not a lot of warm weather recently, but we'll have to warm up into May and June before some of that gets realized throughout some of these river valleys and the hydrologies. Jumping south now, getting down to the Colorado River. I talked about Lake Powell earlier, reaching a near record low, if not all-time records here at the end of February, early March. We have jumped up a little bit since then with some rain and snowfall earlier in March. We're actually kind of coming back down the wrong way again. Now, I will say we have had that very bountiful snowpack that's up in those upper elevations. We typically start to see realization of that or melting from that getting into some of these reservoirs here in late April, in May, as we begin to warm up in Arizona, in Utah, and southwest Colorado. And we can just kind of look back to 2022 to get a sense of when that might be occurring. Obviously, give or take a few weeks, depending on the exact temperatures and how those warm up. But sometime in late April, sometime in May, climatologically, we're pretty positive we're going to get warmer temperatures right in Arizona. We'll start to melt some of that snowpack that will begin to fill those Lake Powell water levels. Unlikely we reach any sort of minimum again as we get into late April here. So hoping for an improvement in the water situation out there. We have more snowpack up in the mountains now than we did last year. So we could even see perhaps a bigger improvement, although there's some water use calculations to factor in there as well. Taking a look at Lake Mead, the story was a bit more stark at summer of 2022 when it reached those record low water levels. We've improved since then, but not significantly so. Again, I think we'll see a similar story here as we melt the waters getting into Lake Powell in May and June. Perhaps we start to improve those Lake Mead water levels going into summer versus some of the drought we were dealing with last year in 2022. And covering kind of the whole gambit here from the interior down through the south over to California. All the rain, the atmospheric river events in California have certainly filled up a number of the reservoirs there. The San Luis Reservoir in the central part of California there on the coastal mountains is effectively full at 99% here. A rain-fed reservoir, certainly another reservoir that gets a lot of its lake levels and output from rain is the Shasta Reservoir up in Northern California. It's at 85% over that historical average. Oroville as well, though that is snow-fed as well. The reservoirs I think I'm more concerned about in terms of flooding and kind of long-term chronic flood risk as we go through the warm-up is the San Joaquin Valley and the Sierra foothills. So we're talking Pine Flat, Millerton, Success further to the south of there, a smaller one, but still has flooding impacts. Those ones are more fed and dependent on that snowpack. And we're talking about that record snowpack up in the Sierra Nevadas, particularly the southern Sierra Nevadas. And that's those being snowpack-fed reservoirs, that melt season really starting here at the end of April, getting into May, depending on when we exactly warm up and how quickly we warm up. That'll be something to watch closely. And I say that because we've already seen some flooding, some rather serious flooding impacts from some of the rain and water coming out of the Sierra Nevada foothills. This is looking at the Sentinel satellite imagery over the San Joaquin Valley in Southern California. Now I have a kind of a special visualization up here that makes standing water very clear. It kind of jumps off. You see the ice, that's the light blue. There's our Sierra Nevada snowpack we've been talking about. Kind of the green beige color, your kind of typical land use, agricultural, forest, and otherwise. But this dark blue color here really allowing some of the standing water and the flooding to jump off the imagery here. And you can see that kind of historic outline of Lake Tulare here in the San Joaquin Valley. This is a concern not only in the future, but right now here today. This picture valid as of last week. We've certainly seen that historic lake bed trying to refill as a result of some of the recent flooding and a little bit of the snowpack melting here. I think this could potentially get worse in May and June when we typically see the highest rate of that snowpack melting, and these rivers, which are already getting swollen, some of them even standing off on this picture from space here, coming out of some of these reservoirs, those could increase in their levels as we get some of that snowpack into the area. So we're keeping an eye on this, not only for the impacts of the Tulare Basin, but we're starting to see some standing water along some of those rivers, even beyond that as well. And I talked about that San Luis Reservoir, just kind of noticing it here on the top of the image at that 99% capacity, standing out very clearly here at the top of this image. Now, when we talk about the timing on that snowpack and the snow melt, we have been cold across California, and cold in some of the upper elevations. Snowpack tends to reinforce cold weather. If you have a high snowpack, you tend to be a bit colder naturally. We're looking here at the Yosemite Valley average temperatures this year. And we would expect this to reflect kind of the colder 2023 start we've had. And you'll notice that we've had very little in the way of warm days here in the Yosemite Valley, kind of up in the Sierra Nevadas. Been colder on the colder side of this graph. This black line here, that's your typical temperature average chart for a normal year. And you'll notice why I keep kind of reiterating end of April, May into June, because that's when we really kind of materially warm up away from that freezing line, that blue line here running across the middle of the screen, and kind of in here where we'd expect some of that more rapid snow melt. Now, I'll say if we stay cooler, and we've been cooler because of the snow, so it's kind of a cat and mouse situation, but if we stay cooler through here and don't warm up abruptly or aggressively, that will kind of help to spread out that snow melt over a longer period of time. It's very much kind of a rate of change conversation. We're talking about the reservoirs and how much water they can handle in terms of flooding and downstream risks. So if we can avoid a rapid warm up, certainly in late April, getting into May, we don't want all that water coming through the hydrology all at once. It's harder to save it for future use, and it causes more flooding issues. So that'll be something we keep an eye on. I'll just kind of spill the beans now. We aren't seeing kind of a major warm-up in the forecast right now. Kind of too early to say for a time period all the way looking out into May, but at least right now, kind of crossing our fingers that that's something we don't see, and we don't see a huge signal for that as of yet. That all being said, let's kind of jump into the forecast here. This is looking at the all hazards map valid here as of Wednesday afternoon, and kind of quickly you'll notice it's rather clear across the west. Some winter storm warnings out in the northern elevations and Utah. They're having that big snow year. But other than that, largely clear across the western region, other than some local flood advisories. Now, we talked about the rain and potential snow coming for the Pacific Northwest out of this next system. It's not quite as potent. It's a little bit far away, 24 to 48 hours, so some of those advisories, watches, and warnings aren't out yet. Although it's possible we get some flood advisories, winter storm watches for the Cascades and some other areas. We'll keep an eye on that. But getting out into that forecast, this is looking at the ECMWF, the European Model Forecast. I'll make this valid as of this afternoon here on Wednesday afternoon. You'll notice that really already 5 p.m. Wednesday evening, light rain possible in some of the coastal areas, even all the way through northern California, potentially the far northern coastline there, but certainly through Washington, Oregon, getting into the Willamette Valley. Rainfall potential starting tonight, overnight into Thursday, through the day on Thursday, kind of reaching perhaps peak intensity in the Willamette Valley and Washington, western Washington that is, and then certainly northern California, very early Friday or overnight Thursday into Friday. And if you look closely, I know it's hard to see some of these isobars here coming out of the Pacific Ocean, but we have more kind of a southerly component to the flow here coming into the Willamette Valley. And I think this is relevant for east of the elevation or east of the Cascades and the rain shadows in eastern Washington. And you'll notice the system's coming in like this, and we get this southerly flow, winds blowing from the south to north through the valley, that tends to allow more lift, more precip to get in on the leeward side of some of these mountains, such that I think we get a bit more rain out of this in terms of the Willamette Valley, and perhaps more significant or at least material rainfall moving into parts of eastern Washington, and even getting over into the Snake River Valley, perhaps the Treasure Valley in Oregon, just kind of as the trajectory of the system, the way it's coming in. That's looking at Friday. Let's take this out through the weekend. Clears some of the interior into the day on Friday into Saturday. We kind of clear things up a bit. I do think we see some light rain showers move through the North Valley of California, even through the Central Coast, San Francisco and areas north of there, but nothing too significant, not talking an inch of rainfall even. And then in the upper elevations of Sierra Nevada, perhaps some light snow out of this, maybe a couple inches, maybe up to a half a foot. But based on some of the recent storm systems, nothing really to write home about out of this weekend system here. We get something of a break on Saturday, but we're going to keep this active pattern around for a while, I think. Breakthrough Saturday, but then overnight Sunday, we see kind of another glancing blow coming through the coastal areas of Oregon and Washington, and again kind of sneaking through the northern part of California at the end of the storm system here. This one still has something of that southern component to it, and that these kind of winds are trying to get into some of these interior locations, such that I think eastern Washington, parts of Oregon, even over to the Snake River Valley, do get some significant, or not significant, but some measurable precipitation over something like a trace or just a light drizzle, and then snow in the Cascades as well, adding to their snowpack there. That's through Monday. Into Tuesday, the system gets more zonal, and by that I just mean more west to east in terms of that flow, less of that southerly wind component. I think that could be a better snowmaker for the Cascades, but less rainfall and precipitation getting east of the rain shadow as a result of that. That takes us all the way out to Wednesday. That's a whole week at this point. Just kind of a recap, looking at precipitation totals over that time frame, valid as of next Tuesday. You'll notice in the Willamette Valley, some higher values there, 2 to 3 inches potentially. I think locally you could get a bit lower than that depending on where exactly you sit in the valley, maybe on the western side. Some areas could be even higher than that. And then eastern Washington, parts of eastern Oregon, over to the Snake River Valley, we could be seeing something of a 1/2 inch to 1 inch in eastern Washington, northeast Oregon, lesser amounts in the Snake River Valley with less focused flow there. Northern half of California, certainly expecting precipitation out of this, some snowfall in the higher elevations. Coastal rainfall could be a bit higher in the far northern coastline. And then some of these showers moving through this weekend. I think it's possible we get some, maybe a 1/4 inch or something in that range in the North Valley of California, or perhaps all the way through the central coastline and the San Francisco area. Not expecting much out of this south of the Delta or in the San Joaquin Valley, at least not at this time. Not expecting a huge change there. Snowfall out of this, less of a story, not really focused on the Sierra Nevadas. We do get a nice upgrade for the Cascade snowpack through Washington, just a bit getting east of there, east of the rain shadow into the Idaho elevations and eastern Oregon, not as much as some of the areas closer to the coastline. And then you do see that light snow, perhaps a 1/2 foot or so in some of the northern Sierra Nevadas. Temperatures over the next 10 days with these systems coming through, not a surprise that we're going to keep temperatures a bit colder. I do think early next week we get something of a warm up, and that could feel quite significant just because it's been so long since we've had seasonal or even temperatures on the slightly warmer side of things. So perhaps Sunday, Monday, Tuesday into some of the interior parts of the west and even through parts of central or southern California. If we want to go beyond that, that forecast kind of took us out to Wednesday of next week, but looking beyond that, no surprise that I'm going to look to the clues in the jet stream in terms of the forecast. This is looking at the GFS ensemble forecast. I'll make this valid as of Wednesday evening here. There's that jet stream we looked at the very beginning of the video, those fast winds moving out into the Northeast Pacific. That will make its way over to the Oregon and Northern California coastline Thursday night as that system moves through in earnest. We talked about it reaching that peak kind of in the Thursday overnight time period. We get something of a break on Saturday we talked about, but here comes more focused flow over the Pacific Northwest over the weekend. Late Sunday, we talked about that next system moving in. I will say, as we get some of this ridging action over the west, interior west proper, this is that kind of brief warm-up I talked about. This is really an upper-level high-pressure system or a ridge in the jet stream, allowing some warmth to build into the interior west and perhaps getting over into the at least the southern or San Joaquin Valley in California. And that could feel like something more of a significant change just based on how cold it has been. But it's not something that's going to be lasting. In fact, if I just take this forecast out a bit, we kind of lose that ridging over the west. We actually bring in more troughing kind of at the end of the time period out into Thursday, April 13th, and then going into next weekend. I see not a huge signal here, but certainly, if anything, troughing over the west, and that will help bring in colder air. We've seen kind of this reversion to troughing over the west further out in the forecast. I don't think that's the model's doing anything incorrect. That's just it's latching onto that colder snowpack locked up in the elevations of the west, and that just naturally helps promote troughiness and cold weather kind of sticking around. It's kind of this kind of sticky feedback mechanism. Well, we have troughing because we have snow, and we have snow because we have troughing and it's cold. And that's just the way the atmosphere and the land interactions work sometimes. And I think we're seeing that through April. So brief warm-up at the beginning of the week, but not something I think that's going to be significant in terms of that snow melt conversation we had at the beginning of this video. Kind of building a story there, just want to compare what we talked at with the Climate Prediction Center. Are we seeing agreement there? Are the discrepancies something we should cover? The 6 to 10 day outlook for temperatures cooler. We talked about some of the troughing coming in April 11th through the 15th. We do see some breaks here for California with some of these systems more biased toward the Pacific Northwest, Northern Oregon, and Washington. This is looking out at the end of next week. If we go beyond that, that 6 to 10 day, and we get all the way out into the 8 to 14 day outlook. Cooler weather sticking around out west, perhaps not as an extreme of a signal, but we don't see that quite too often when we look at some of these 8 to 14 day charts. And then precipitation maybe slightly on the wetter side. And I think the story that we're seeing here in this kind of 8 to 14 day time frame, if I take you back to that jet stream forecast and I make this valid kind of that April 15th, April 16th, 17th time frame, that time period we were just looking at from the Climate Prediction Center, we see this kind of general troughiness across the west. I think that helps bring some cooler temperatures in. We just saw that. And then just kind of based on the trajectory of this troughiness, the subtropical jet down here, it's not out of the realm of possibilities. We do get some systems kind of curling down here out of the northwest into parts of California, Oregon, or the interior west, kind of leaving the door open for some of these weaker systems out of the northwest. It makes sense to me in the 8 to 14 day time period that we could see slightly above average precipitation, kind of regionally wide across the west, but not a huge signal. I doubt we're going to see another big storm event or another big atmospheric river event. Anything can happen in meteorology, just not seeing that signal right now. While we're on the page, just to recap that April forecast we talked about a week or two ago. Temperatures, we expected them to be colder. We talked about the added snowpack, the effects from that. We talked about the colder waters off the west coast of the U.S., that negative PDO signal. So cooler waters off the coast here kind of helps keep that coastline colder. And then the interior west, we have that snowpack, that record snowpack in Utah, California, Nevada. That's helping keep the temperatures down here. We would expect that to continue through April despite some of these brief warm-ups. And then the Pacific Northwest, we expect it to be a bit wetter in April, and I think we're seeing that with some of these systems come through. So right now, consistency with the forecast and then that drier signal further south into central and southern California and parts of Arizona as well, which we have not had much to talk about in terms of the forecast here this evening. If we want to look out beyond all of that, right, we looked at the beginning of the forecast, then we talked about the jet stream. If we want to go even beyond that into mid to late April, our tool shifts back to the MJO, the Madden-Julian oscillation. If we look at where it is now, we're kind of getting out of null space into phase 6 and 7. There's some high confidence that through the next week here, getting into mid-April, we will be in phase 7. And you'll notice a number of these models, we call these spaghetti plots because it kind of looks like a plate of spaghetti here. And this certainly with this kind of pasta color, but not much movement out of phase 7. We get all the way out to April 20th here, 13th, 15th, 17th, April 19th, where we're hardly getting out of phase 7, maybe getting into phase 8 right at the end of the period. Hard to say definitively. And if we go back and look at climatology, in April's, where we're in phase 7 for quite a while, when we're in INSO neutral, not a La Nina, not an El Nino, so where we're in right now, and we ask it, what's that typical pattern across the Pacific Northwest? Well, here's the Pacific Northwest way down here, the bottom of this chart. This blue color here, that's troughing across the Pacific Northwest, which we typically get in a phase 7 in April under this regime. So we're seeing that in the forecast. We're seeing that cooler weather across the west, kind of reflecting that troughiness. We're seeing kind of the active storm track or precipitation and snow through the Pacific Northwest. I think that's consistent with what we see here. It's consistent with the Climate Prediction Center, their forecast for April here. So the weather and the atmosphere, I think, is playing along. It doesn't always do that. So, I'll take a cookie when I can get one. But I think this kind of April forecast is shaking out like we thought it was, at least at the moment, with perhaps some drier weather kind of beyond this flow to the south. So central, southern California, getting into Arizona, New Mexico, perhaps parts of southern Utah as well, getting a break from some of the recent atmospheric river events. So consistency here in the forecast through the end of April, a higher confidence forecast that this pattern sticks around. I will say when we get kind of near the end of April, not only are we getting out of kind of that forecast confidence skill range, but we're liable to a pattern change at that point where maybe we get some warmer temperatures into the area and we start having to worry and talk more about that snowmelt conversation, but it's just not here yet. If we look at the ECMWF weeklies, just kind of getting a different take on the forecast through April. This is looking April 9th through May 9th. It's a 30-day forecast for precipitation anomalies. Kind of curiously, we talked about the likelihood of an active Pacific Northwest, certainly cooler across the west. The European model, ECMWF here, they're being a bit more aggressive with the dry weather. Not only dry in Arizona, Southern California, but all the way up through Northern California, Nevada, Utah, Oregon, the Cascades, Washington. All in something of a drier pattern here. I'll say, just based on the conversation we just had, I'm a bit skeptical that let's call it the dry line, is that far north. You'll notice they do have British Columbia wet, just north of the national border there. I think that line ends up closer to, let's say, central or southern Oregon, maybe cutting off somewhere in northern California. I'm just not seeing that dry pattern through the end of April for the Pacific Northwest. We'll keep an eye on this as kind of an alternative forecast at this point, but I don't put a ton of weight into this forecast for now. I'm also somewhat skeptical we get this huge dry punch into the Midwest, but we'll keep an eye on this as we look out into the future at the end of April. The good news in terms of temperatures, if we look at that 30-day temperature forecast from that same ECMWF model, we're not seeing a huge warm-up either out west. So it is a bit drier, but we're not seeing a huge warm-up that would cause as big of a concern in terms of that snowpack melting all at once. So I do think that is good news. Monthly precipitation forecast, we talked about this in the Pacific Northwest being wetter. Just to kind of juxtapose that ECMWF run we just looked at, that Euro run was drier through the Pacific Northwest. It was also very dry in the American Midwest, whereas the Climate Prediction Center forecast just a few days ago issued on March 31st, expecting, if anything, a bit wetter through the middle part of the country. Impact for planting there certainly east of the divide. It's been a while since I think we've looked at a chart like this. This is just a reminder, a Havmuller diagram of the Central Pacific. We looked at this earlier to get an idea of when La Nina might be exiting the conversation. That happened in early March. I believe March 9th was the kind of final day. And you'll see the reason for that. These red colors here are those strong westerly wind bursts across the Central Tropical Pacific. Those tend to weaken La Nina or warm up the ocean waters in the Central Tropical Pacific. We saw that. This is effectively what ended La Nina. Since then, there hasn't been as significant as westerlies through the Central Tropical Pacific, so we haven't seen ocean temperatures warm up considerably beyond this. They haven't gotten much colder as well. We haven't dipped back into La Nina, which I think is good news long term. But you'll notice as we go out into the forecast, which is the bottom of this graph, so here's April 5th, here's today, as we go over the next 15 days or so, we start to get more of these westerlies built into the Central Pacific. I think that will work to warm up those ocean waters again and get us inching closer a little bit toward El Nino. We've talked about there's an El Nino likelihood in the forecast for summer, and El Nino is something of an absorbing barrier. And what I mean by that is, I mentioned it before, but the atmosphere, the ocean interactions, they tend to feed back on one another to the point where if you kind of warm up toward El Nino, you increase the chances of El Nino, right? It's one of these kind of feedback mechanisms. If you don't warm it up, you kind of risk never even getting into that absorbing barrier. So if that makes any sense at all. So kind of when I see this, what I mean by that is when I see these westerly wind bursts in the Pacific over the next 15 days, if these materialize, it just increases the chances we do realize that El Nino potential in terms of summer 2023. If we look at the El Nino kind of box that we typically measure these ocean temperatures in the Central Tropical Pacific, you'll notice that we quickly warmed up these waters out of La Nina in late February, early March. There's that westerly wind burst I talked about warming up those ocean temperatures. We did not see that continue, so we've kind of stayed near neutral in this intro-neutral state. I would expect, as a kind of result of that forecast we just looked at, for a slow creep back up toward this all-important plus 0.5 where we enter El Nino status in the Pacific. So something to watch. As we warm up those ocean temperatures, we just increase the chances we do realize that El Nino potential in summer of 2023. Look at some of these ensemble models of INSO out into the future. Here we are now in March, April, and May. All of them, or just about all of them, have us warming up to some degree, with at least about half of them having us entering some sort of El Nino by June, July, August, September of 2023. Worth noting, not all of them. So, right, there's still some of them that keep us kind of in this INSO neutral, but none of them, not even this crazy outlier, have us dipping back into La Nina, which I think is good news for those of us looking to avoid drought conditions out west for yet another winter. Quickly wanted to touch on potentially some El Nino implications. If we do enter an El Nino over the summer of 2023, we could see some warmer temperatures out west, particularly for the Pacific Northwest. You might see some of that reflected here. This is the Climate Prediction Center forecast for temperature anomalies, June, July, August. We do see this kind of extension of warmer temperatures up through the western region, the Southwest, Texas, all the way up into the Pacific Northwest. That's a possibility. We're seeing that in some of the forecast models. If we look over at the ECMWF, which has been somewhat aggressively warming us up into an El Nino in summer of 2023, their seasonal model at least, we can see, I think, a reflection of that Climate Prediction Center forecast for June, July, August, looking at their temperature anomalies. Not a huge signal, but we do kind of see an overlap of that area for higher temperatures. Now, to moderate this, or perhaps to even work against it, one thing we've seen from the ECMWF seasonal forecast here in terms of precipitation is when we do enter El Nino years, that tends to be good for crop growing conditions in the central part of the country. And I think you can see why here. We get quite a bit of rainfall through the middle part of the country. That would be certainly good for yields in the middle or the American Midwest and the breadbasket there. But if you look over in the desert Southwest, in recent years, kind of these hot west years, we've seen a more active monsoon as a result of the heat. That heat in the Intermountain West tends to fuel our monsoon season at the end of summer. So the fact it's forecasting a drier monsoon or a drier start to the monsoon season here in June, July, August, the ECMWF at least has me thinking it's not quite seeing as much heat out west as it could be. Just one signal now, but perhaps we won't be dealing with as much heat waves despite maybe that warmer than average forecast at the moment. Something to keep an eye on, maybe two conflicting signals there before we get too aggressive one way or the other with the forecast. If we take this out to July, August, September, kind of getting the heart of that desert versus American Southwest monsoon season, again, don't see a strong signal there either way. So keeping an eye on that long term. That is all I have for you all this evening. Thank you for watching.